Okay, I will get started because we are being recorded, and that's a good thing. It's not, and it's part of the collection for the society, but most importantly, we can share this recording with friends, family members, and lots of folks who couldn't make it to this, so they get a more of a flavor of our the subject of our day, who is Peter B. Vaill. So I'm going to start us off with a little quick screen share just to set the mood. It's not that quick because I can't find it right off here. Yeah, here we go. That's not it. Not very smooth, Dave. I had it set and then I must have gotten distracted. I'm looking for the picture that I set up. It's always got to be something that I mess up. So I'm going to stop the screen share for a few minutes and just begin with getting my okay. Why can't I find that? Here it is. Okay, here we go. So there are several pictures that I have collected of Peter, but I selected this one to start off thinking because that's how I remember him. Youthful with that big smile, casual, love the outdoors, but he's kind of looking at us and saying, I'm with you in spirit, folks. Let's make this an easygoing conversation, and let's all try to learn something from each other. So we are reflecting on the legacy in a society of teachers, because of all things Peter was, he was always a teacher. When he was writing, when he was talking, when he was walking down the street, when he was interacting with his caregivers, he had a teacher's mindset, and he always extracted from those moments something that he could use to help someone else learn. So he was a constant teacher. He also, for several of us in this group today, sent us out into the world. Kathy Ross, Eric, me, others who were his doctoral students, to continue to make teaching and practice itself matter. And he was always very eager to find out how that was going, so he kept in correspondence with a lot of us. He also would like his legacy to be, I told you so, and not to be picking on us, but saying, I talked about white water back in the late 80s. I said to people who were learning managing, you're going to constantly be upside down, bumping against things. You're going to be always in a kind of a trouble. So keep on learning. And of course, Peter would have loved the challenge of this conversation. Not sure what that is, but anyway, as you look at Peter in that picture, anyone, what thoughts come to mind?
Well, I'll throw in something not very profound, I suspect. That's a little older version of Peter than when I first met him, which was around 1970. And then he was a little thinner when I first knew him. But part of what there are a lot of things I remember about Peter, but part of it was the very distinctive intellect. Peter always had his own way of thinking about the world. And his ways were, they weren't my ways, they were his, and there was a kind of idiosyncratic quality to Peter. And one of the pieces that I don't think gets mentioned a lot, but that I used to be in love with that Peter wrote, I think it was in Org Dynamics, he wrote a thing called On Exploring. And it was a sailboat deal. You had a guy who was a sailor who loved to explore, go out on the ocean and explore anywhere. And it was, I guess, a prelude to Whitewater. But that idea of being willing to risk yourself, to go out into the unknown and sort of learn from the process of being in places you've never been before, that's part of how I imagine Peter.
I can offer my really corny tribute and try and make it as brief as possible. Peter would have been a little bit older when I first met him. I actually I have a master's in computer science, and so I started the MBA program at George Washington in 1984. And I was working at IBM, and between some things that were happening at work and taking Peter for the OB course, it just completely opened my eyes to human behavior and dynamics in a way that I was totally ignorant of before. And so he's had the biggest impact on my career by far, because I then changed my major in my MBA program to organizational behavior. And, at the time, I think I was about 25. And then I switched my whole career over to human behavior thereafter, working for a management consulting firm and so forth. And then 10 years after that, I decided to go get a PhD. And so I went back to the George Washington University, and Peter became my dissertation director. And the really corny part of this tribute is that, I'm a Christian, and sometimes people wonder, well, like, what is heaven going to be like? Can you sit around and, on clouds and eat bonbons all day? Won't that be kind of boring? And so the closest example that I can think of was, as a doctoral student, I met with Peter every week or so, every couple of weeks. And every single one of those conversations, I walked away with a broader horizon, a bigger perspective, something I'd learned. And so, I thought, I could do this for infinity. It's like, if you can just keep having your mind stretched in every single interaction, that would be a good deal. And so that's who Peter was for me. He was that person that just constantly stretched my horizons.
Wow. Heaven is a constant conversation with Peter Vaill. That's a good one, David. Eric, thank you. Other thoughts? You got to unmute, David. Yeah, they got you all muted until you unmute.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I knew all about Peter and his work way before I ever met him. And when I arrived as a doctoral student at UCLA, most of his writing that hadn't been published was in mimeograph papers in the doctoral student lounge. And I missed him by 6 months. He had just left UCLA when I got there. And I think he went to Connecticut or somewhere like that. But we both shared Bob Tenenbaum as a mentor. And so I then met him once in person at the academy, maybe in the 80s. I was a full-time consultant at the time, and that was my first time I started interacting with the academy. But after he was more limited and in his wheelchair, his assisted living place is only a mile from where I live, and he's not that far from the University of St. Thomas. And so when I came to St. Thomas as a professor 10 years ago, I got to go over and meet him, and then we got the honor of writing a chapter about him. And Jackie Milbrand and I were writing that, and we would go visit. We would call him once in a while if we had a question on something, but he's a personal guy, and it was so clear that he more appreciated when we would come over there and sit down for an hour or so and have a sandwich, have a little lunch. They had a little luncheonette where he stayed. And we did that, I don't know, 5 or 6 times. And besides getting the chapter done, you know, the conversation went everywhere. And so what impressed me at first, because we had only met once in person before, and it was 20 or 30 years earlier, so it was not something we each remembered real well. So it was a little bit like meeting him, and it was, what was so interesting was you wouldn't be a minute or two into the beginning of a conversation and he would have a question for you about something. Either something you had written and shared with him, or some new question that is on his mind that week. And we would walk in and he would, no time, would start off with questions. I even remember asking him a specific question one time, because I thought his perspective would be interesting. And before answering, guess what he did? He said, "And what do you think about that question?" So there was Peter that I got to know just in the last 10 years much more closely. But I never had the privilege of, or not the privilege, but the honor of having him as my teacher. And I can imagine from what all of you know that would have been a wonderful experience too. So thank you.
Kathy, Kathy Ross, can you fill in a bit of that blank as one who was taught by Peter Vaill?
Yes, I mean, the memories are just flooding through me. I so agree with Eric. Peter was my dissertation advisor, and it was just magical to spend time with him. And I totally resonate with having your mind stretched. He was simultaneously challenging and endorsing. I always felt challenged, but I always felt supported. And I always left a conversation with him stronger and more confident. And his allegiance to the practice, because I've been a practitioner all my life. And I will piggyback on what Eric said. It just changed the way that I experience my work. It took it to a whole new level because he respected practitioners.
He more than respected him. He often would say, "I can't wait for the next practitioner who comes through the door, whoever it is, whatever they want to stick in me. I still want to, there's something I can learn here." And he had a tremendous, and also he's very egalitarian about that. As I said, he'd be happy to talk to the Pope, or he'd be more than happy to talk to someone, just, carrying him over to an appointment at the hospital. So he was amazing that way. Other thoughts? These are wonderful.
Well, I got to know Peter in the early 70s, and he was one of the 5 or 6 people who became my sort of elder brother, practitioners of the academic profession. And I loved, he was completely insouciant about academic scholarly writing. He had no trouble acknowledging he was not interested in it. I found that terrific. I was trying to assert my, whatever my idiosyncratic writing or non-writing style might be. And so I felt reinforced by that. He had a combination of elegance and informality and just sheer friendliness that I think of him at the piano, creating a bon vivant atmosphere. And so we had lots of exchanges. We had a graduate student that went down to GW, and I had been her advisor at Harvard, and she was a brilliant but difficult human being. And we had a number of conversations by phone about her, but he just remained as a kind of figure in the Knights of the Round Table for me, sort of distinctive knight. I haven't seen him for years and years and years, and I've missed him. I could have, of course, but I didn't.
No, thank you. Other thoughts?
I don't want to take time away from others who might want to speak, but I will
It's a
say,
Quaker meeting. We speak as we move to speak.
I will say that I actually just completed sort of a tribute article to him. I just found out this morning it's being accepted by Organizational Dynamics. So I had occasion to kind of go through his whole body of work that I could get a hold of. And I would just offer a few comments on his legacy. You know, what did he kind of leave us going forward, if there's time permitting?
Definitely. Give us a taste of it, and then we'll be sure to read it when it comes out. Oh.
Well, if you want me to speak now, I'll just
Yeah, go ahead. Just, you know, we're,
you know, I was surprised. There were several little nuggets I picked up along the way, but I think it was Bill that said this. He at one point laments, you know, trying to get things published in academic journals is such a hassle. You know, you're completely at the mercy of the reviewers and the editor. He said, I really like publishing book chapters where you have a lot more autonomy. So,
yeah.
so that was a little nugget I picked up along the way. But, you know, I was really kind of inspired by his most recent thinking about management was that we might want to substitute the word encouragement, and he spelled it EN-courage-ment,
Yeah.
with the idea that really being a manager is about courage. Now, encouragement in the vernacular has this kind of cheerleading connotation, but that's not what he meant at all. You know, that he would quote people like Deming saying, you know, that drive out fear is an important part of what has to happen, and other people that said, you know, you really need to have guts to be a manager. So he really, I think in his last years, was kind of focusing heavily on this idea of really maybe management is primarily encouragement. So I found that pretty inspiring. I also found where he wrote something about, you know, he's cited as having the seminal paper in 1972 on kind of the high-performing organization, that field. And he wrote at the time, I think it was at the time, maybe later, that he came up with kind of 47 descriptors of this high-performing organization.
Yeah.
But he didn't want to get any more reductionist about it. He didn't want to study it. He didn't want to.
Make them all. Yeah.
He felt like he would lose what he wanted to continue to learn about the Gestalt if he started to look at the pieces too quickly. And so, you know, I was just struck by that. That is so foreign from the thinking of any current management scholar and researcher. So yeah, I'll stop there because I can see other people are getting.
Those are excellent points, though.
But there were several things like that where he's just completely counter to the trajectory of the management field today.
Yeah.
One other thing I'm curious about, a couple of people who were his students talk about how supportive he was. And I'm curious whether, you know, my relationship with Peter began combatively. And he started the fight. I thought, at least that's how I recall it. This was 50 years ago, so the memory is probably. But NTL did a conference on OD around 1970 in Washington. And so I was on there. I was on the program, and I presented a paper that I thought was just terrific at the time. He didn't think it was terrific. He disagreed with my central argument. And he did not hesitate to let me know that he disagreed with the central argument. And it took a few years, I think, before I got over the point of seeing it as a kind of competitive, you know, two guys kind of pissing contest kind of thing. We got well beyond that later on, but I'm curious whether that's a side. Am I the only person who experienced that side of Peter or had that kind of a relationship early on?
Yes, you are, Lee. You're the only one. He's always loved everything the rest of
Oh, it must be me then. You know, well, that's not a surprise.
I think he would tell you right now that he really believed he was doing you a favor to help you move your thinking, not necessarily where he wants to go, but maybe he thought you might take it in another direction. And voila, you wrote the 4 frames, and now you're famous.
That's right. Yeah, without Peter, we never would have got there. So
there you go. No,
I would say that in what I observed, it was fair occasionally to call him curmudgeonly.
Mm-hmm.
But I will say at the same time, I personally didn't have that experience of him, but I saw him in other interactions where I think that would have been a fair descriptor.
Mm-hmm. Others who haven't had a chance to say a little bit?
When I think about Peter, I think about two things. One is I knew him through the society and saw him every year for many, many years. I couldn't guess which the first year I actually had a conversation with him, but he was a regular and I was a regular, and so and he also was a late night person and I was a late night person, and so I spent a fair amount of time over the years just kind of hanging out around him. Not necessarily he was one of my close friends, but just somebody that I knew pretty well and talked to. At some point, Dorothy Marsick asked me to help her do the experiential book that she had done 5 editions of, and I worked on the 6th edition with her. And when we talked about doing a 7th edition, she said, I want to invite Peter in. He's got a lot of interesting exercises, and let's just ask him to co-edit as well. And so I spent quite a lot of time working with Peter on something that for which I don't think he was particularly well known, although I think all of you, because you knew him, probably knew something about the experiential ideas that he had. But he was known for his writing of big ideas as opposed to little exercises. But I had a good time working with him on individual exercises, and his writing style and mine didn't quite match. And so there were some of those confrontations that Lee mentioned before, and we managed to work those out into, he had about 10 things in the 7th edition of that book, which was in about 1990, something like that.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Well, I'm going to jump over and ask Alan some thoughts, because when we had our podcast conversation, he said, well, maybe I'll save a couple of thoughts about Peter for this session. So you told us a little bit about back in the day when you were at Harvard with him. Maybe tell us a little bit more of any other thoughts that come to mind, Alan.
Yeah, it's funny. I just unmuted to get ready to say something, but may or may not answer what you're asking.
Okay.
Peter was a doctoral student a year or two ahead of me, and we shared the same intellectual tradition, which very much had to do with what managers actually do rather than the theoretical models of talking about management. So that was easy, and we became friends. And I considered him, let's see, Bill, I think you said that he was like a big brother, and I had a little bit of the same feeling. But I have one thing that at the time struck me as unusual, and in hindsight fit Peter very well in some of the things that have been said. UCLA, where he had, I think he still was a place that I was looking at to go to. I went out there for interviews. I actually got an offer, but I was temporarily at University of New Hampshire in my first semester, and I'd already started to get engaged with a whole bunch of actually action things. And I was having fun, so I said no to UCLA. But I sort of regretted it because, as far as I could tell, it was one of the few places in the world where they actually cared about action and not more pure academic thing. And then I ended up going off to India. And Peter and I exchanged a few letters. And unfortunately, I've once again misfiled it, but I came across it about a year ago in some old papers I dug up. And one of the things I was reminded of was that Peter had turned quite negative about UCLA, but more about living in Los Angeles. And this was late 60s. I was very much involved in the revolutions of the 60s, including the sexual revolution, and not feeling like a very respectable Harvard Business School type, for sure. But I was slightly taken aback that Peter seemed so old-fashioned and straight-laced. Now, today we would call it spiritualistic, because that's what he was responding to.
Yeah.
But it took me by surprise because I hadn't experienced him that way at all. We had, in our conversations about education, had so agreed. Our views were so parallel that we never had a disagreement of any kind. And I was very surprised. And then over the years came to see that I'll call it spirituality / morality was very much a part of his identity.
Yeah.
What he cared about, what he taught about, what he wrote about, not always by those names, but there was a kind of purity about him that made him very interesting and attractive. And it was combined with the friendliness you all talked about, because he loved the engagement with people and the interaction.
Yeah.
But for me, it was an unusual combination. I mean, I was quite anti-religion and anti-organized religion. And so I was dismissing everything in that territory. And here he was clearly into it. So that's something that I always remembered. And then just to skip to a whole other stage of life, when the conference was held, where was this? I think it was in California. Peter came to be part of it and then had an accident and ended up in a hospital. Do you remember that?
Sure.
Yeah, 7, 8, 9 years ago that was.
It was at Marquette. Yeah, I was going to be hosting him. He
Right.
flew all the way out with his wheelchair so he could speak to about his passion about process.
Right. And then in the most profane thing, the way he got injured was he was going to the bathroom without the wheelchair and fell and hurt himself.
Yeah.
At any rate, Bradford and I said, listen, he's here in the city. He's all alone. Let's go see him. And we did.
That's
And, he clearly was tickled to have company. And it was quite fascinating because he was very immobilized. He could barely move anything, but his head was certainly not immobilized.
Yeah.
And I mean, this is a variation on what a number of people have said. The conversation was incredibly lively. And I don't even remember what we talked about, probably a little of what he was going to say in that panel, but more about the state of OB and what the people in OB thought it was and what we were sure it wasn't. And it was a wonderful hour. And he was hard to reach from then on.
Yeah.
I mean, he didn't answer emails and couldn't always directly get him on the phone. So we only had 1 or 2 other conversations, although I dragged him into helping work on a vision chapter for the Portable MBA in Management book that I edited. And he was very reluctant. He said, you know, it's hard for me to write. And I said, go write. I'll draft some stuff and we'll have a conversation or 2. I'll take notes and incorporate your ideas into the chapter, which is what I did.
Yeah.
And I also took some stuff from things he'd written because he had a wonderful way of talking about vision in organizations. And like me, he believed that it was something that had to be embedded and used and not just stuck up on the wall. He had very good stories about people who had found ways to do that, to make vision a real part of everyday organizational practice. which I believe in, and also was working the notion that vision is not just for the whole organization, that every leader's got to have a vision for what his or her unit does.
That would be Peter. Yeah.
That's fit to that unit.
Yeah.
And that it had to connect to the bigger organization vision, but it wasn't identical because it didn't tell you what accounting should be doing or operations. And yet, if they didn't have some kind of vision, then you couldn't get the most out of the people who worked there. So it helped my thinking, and it was very reassuring because nobody was writing about vision in that way.
Yeah. Those are really, really good memories, and I'm so glad you and David got over there to talk to him. That was a tough moment for him. As we're moving ahead, I'm gonna put Brittany on the spot for a moment, because Brittany, you're probably the only one on the screen who's never met Peter. What are your thoughts as you're hearing us talk about Peter Vaill as an up-and-coming professor of our field?
Yeah, lot of thoughts. But I think probably the one that sums it all up is he's somebody I wish I would have known, that I wish I could have had one of these really special conversations with. And so I'm hoping by being here today, I can get to know him through all of you and your experiences with him. I really just recently got acquainted with him, I think yesterday through the fellows session. And then I think last year somebody had spoke of him too at MOBTS.
Yeah, he actually came in through Zoom last year to speak to a group.
Yeah. So I'm just excited to get to know more about him. I'm also encouraged by his legacy that he's left, as somebody that is trying to find my identity and my way in this world. I'm a practitioner, I am a Christian, and sometimes I feel that these things aren't always accepted in the greater academy. So as I'm trying to find my way, it's encouraging to hear that there are other people out there like me.
Sure.
Brittany, can you tell us just a few more words about yourself? Most of us sort of know each other a bit, but tell us just a little bit more. You said.
Sure. Well, let's see. I guess I'm going into my third year of my PhD program in OBHR. But prior to this, I worked I was an academic advisor and an instructor at Northern Illinois University. I did that for 4 years. I loved working with students and having them in and out of my office every day. But I made the jump to a PhD. I also completed my MBA at NIU as well. I actually started that while I was still a practitioner. I started my career in banking and finance, both on the structured side and then on the regulatory side. I worked for the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago as a bank examiner. I think I knew I wanted to be a professor when I was an undergrad, but for so many reasons, the twists and turns of life, I took a little while getting back to academia. But yeah, that's where I am now.
Great.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I'm delighted that that you were attracted to learning more, and you can listen to Peter in 17 recordings of our conversations about the nature of practice. As I've been plugging this, I'd like to get a perspective of Peter from Joan, because you've known him in a number of ways. You also knew him back when he was at Jim's place playing the piano. I mean, you know a lot about Peter, perhaps, that we could bring into the conversation right now.
I will, thank you, David. I'll do it in a different way too. We're all talking about Peter as the teacher, as the one who challenges ideas. And when I first met him, he was asking about me.
Oh, yeah.
But it was the learner in him, because I said I had completed my doctorate under Eric Trist at Wharton. And it was like, wow.
Yeah.
You studied with Eric Trist.
He loved
and
it.
he went on and on about him. And that was really special because Peter was somebody who I was looking up to and admiring, but he was turning it around and saying there are others whom he is deeply admiring of. And that was special. And of course, the piano and the cigarette dangling and whatever was the other part of it. But we talk about the whole individual, and he was. And Dave and I did one of those webinars way back when with Peter, if you remember that.
Yeah.
And we had that was a claim to fame that we decided to do that for the society long before they were done. Lee had participated in one too.
Yeah.
What was interesting is I think we had one of the highest attendances on the webinar because everybody had heard about it. That we sent out the notice, but his students from far and wide, I'm exaggerating.
Antioch students and
Antioch students, they were all there.
GW.
Wanting to just reconnect. And the way Brittany's saying you want to get to know him, they wanted to be able to connect with him, or Kathleen had talked about what he did with you as the advisor. And that really struck with me. And then the last comment is some of you here knew Gil Boyer, who was probably a pretty bombastic person, to put it, but he and Peter engaged in really serious conversations. And they really connected with each other and spent time talking. And I also talked with Peter when he was in the hospital. I had talked with his daughter when she was there too. And so those are a lot of different mentions or memories, Dave.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say bombastic about Gil. I would actually use Eric's word of curmudgeonly, and I can see why. The curmudgeon in both of them might have got mobilized by that.
Yeah, that's a fair word, but they really connected with each other.
Yeah.
At a level, and it was really interesting to see. Gil did the same thing with Andre.
Yeah.
They would just go off and have conversations. And some of you don't know, most of you here would have known Gil, but some of you don't. One of those most unforgettable characters, but that doesn't have a place here.
Well, in a way it does, because of the variety of folks who had some contact with Peter and wanted more at our society meetings, in other ways. There's I think the big rule of thumb here, so far as I'm hearing it, is we've been enhanced, that we have a different view of ourselves now, even in a brief encounter, or even reading something that Peter wrote, because he wrote as if he's speaking to us and saying, have you thought of this? You might want to think of that. It was that kind of writing. And so you feel like, okay, I'm ready for some more. Back to Eric, it would be so nice for any of us on the screen to go back and have more conversations with Peter, or go ahead and have more conversations with Peter. Let me come at it one other way here, because you guys have been wonderful in bringing these points of view in. Dale, do you have some memories of Peter Vaill?
Well, I remember Peter's sense of humor. I remember about 1995 sitting at lunch with him, and he recounting in detail the Houston Oilers lost in the playoffs in 1993 to the Bills. They blew a 37-point lead in the fourth quarter at overtime. So I remember Peter's having a good sense of humor. And I remember being enlightened by him at the conference. Your allusion to the whitewater rafting is one I've used many times over the years, and is a very vivid metaphor for how I think about things today. So,
thank you. He had a fixation, because he didn't have a chance to get out and about very much in those later years. So he watched a lot of ESPN, and he really, really was concerned about the Vikings and couldn't quite understand why they couldn't take his leadership through the screen as he was shouting out, "Don't do that, do this." He just loved that. So,
Dave, can I read a couple sentences that Peter wrote? I think it would be
that'd be great.
Honored. And I think these were also quoted in Dave's book chapter. So you got to read Dave's Dave's book chapter about Peter if you haven't already.
It's on my website, and actually, come read it.
I think these couple sentences both express kind of the profound thinking that Peter often brought, but also the beautiful writing style. So let me read out a couple here. Theory and practice do not integrate. They dance with each other, sometimes lustily, but just as often ploddingly, or with one lording over the other, or warily and with stony indifference. But it also must be said that in a school of administration, management, leadership, or practice, if theory and practice do not dance with each other somehow, the learner will graduate not knowing much about practice, not having gained any increment in concrete skill, nor remembering any of the theories that were intended to be relevant in the future. So I love that metaphor of dancing, sometimes lustily, sometimes ploddingly, and you know, and again, I think the writing's beautiful, but the insight is so profound.
That's it.
How if we don't connect theory and practice, the learners walk away with very little. And so I think that was that's another real legacy I take from his career and his life.
Well, it's not only a legacy, but when he had an opportunity to record for the 2010 OBTC at University of Mexico, he was on with a couple of other legacy folks, and in that he introduced 3 things in 2010 that were on his mind and that he wanted to keep thinking about and perhaps writing about. One of which was practice, and so that started him working on a manuscript, which turned out to be close to 300 pages. Worked very hard at it, and that's when I stepped in. But my point is that he started the whole thing by saying, you know theory, but do you know practice? And the answer is, no, we know a lot of theory, speaking to us.
Could I throw in one other thing that
Please do.
Fits in, I think, in terms of MOBTS, once OBTC. When my first OBTC, one of the first impressions I got is there are 3 people who are really kind of the core of this issue. There's Dave Bradford, who is kind of the spiritual leader, cultural embodiment. Larry Michelson, who was kind of doing the business at the time. And then Peter, who was the editor of the journal, which started off as Exchange and has gradually gone through a couple of different iterations, but it makes sense that Peter would have been in that role, kind of trying to. It was one of the things that David always wanted was for the society to have a clear connection to thought and theory and practice, and that we really codified some of what we were doing in a way that the world could experience it, and Peter played a key role in that.
Good point, Lee. I can remember getting my editions of that. It would almost look like a newsletter in the early days.
Yeah, red cover. It wasn't quite mimeographed, but
a little past mimeograph.
But I wanted to read it no matter what, even though I knew him as his former student. I just wanted to read it because I wanted to get a feel. I wanted to find out if other people whose heads can actually move around 360 degrees and be interested and curious about everything. And one of the reasons that he helped me fall in love with organizational behavior is that he allowed me to think that way and said, if you don't think that way, you really don't get context. You don't get system. You don't get changing circumstances. And if you think that there's only one thing to pay attention to, if you're in a real world practicing, you're going to get smacked upside the head. So he really thought when he was writing in that early exchange that he was reaching out to people who some studied sociology, some were science, like Eric and Kathy in different worlds altogether. But he thought this was a point of congress for all kinds of thinkers because the subject matter is humans being organizations. That really mattered a lot to him. We have a few more minutes. I would love to have more thoughts.
I'll say something if no one else jumps in, but another thing that was part of Peter that just is completely lost is that he really felt it was important to teach management by talking about Lao Tzu or Heidegger, or he recommended that you read the New Yorker. He recommended that those of us in the field write novels like Dave Fearon did. So this whole idea that we could teach management through the humanities, it's completely lost on any of my colleagues these days. So, when I had him for the OB MBA class, we studied, I think it was Zubin Mehta conducting the Los Angeles Philharmonic, right? Which, none of my colleagues are thinking in those terms at all these days. It's just that it may be lost to history, that whole notion.
Well, let's get it back. David,
Yeah.
And then Jim. Dave, did you have something you wanted to say? Dave Jameson?
Oh yeah. Listening to some of these last conversations, and especially Eric, the quote that you read, when Peter and I would get together, and this was in recent years, it's only for the last 3 or 4 years, one of the things I knew right away about he and I were kin somehow, and it was because we know how good of a scholar he was, but none of our conversations were about his scholarship. They were always about the integration into practice. And based partly on my entire career and set of choices I made, I've been a vocal advocate for the scholar practitioner role and how important it is. But not only in the academic world, I'm trying to get that role to be powerful in the practice world too.
Right.
So we have thoughtful practice, we have theory-guided practice, we have evidence-based practice. The problem is they're so far apart and they're so siloed that it's very, very difficult. But I was telling him that we had formed an OD Education Association probably 8 or 10 years ago, and I was part of the group that founded it. And in recent years, I've passed on the chairing of that to Deb O'Neill at Bowling Green State. And one of the things we've done in the last 3 years is we've made educating the scholar practitioner as the real core of what that education association is interested in. And it's mostly people who are directors of OD programs at various places. And so we've done something at the academy every year, and each year we've been refining better and better. What do we really mean, and how in the world do you educate somebody who actually cares about and understands both the theoretical side and the practice side? So many of our conversations just within 2 years ago were he loved to have those conversations.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Jim, you had a thought you wanted to share.
I'm sorry I was away. I had a double connectivity problem. Too little connectivity to the internet and too much connectivity to my wife. But here I am back.
Can't help you. One of those things.
At the time I was most interested, because the last I heard was something about the sexual revolution. So I was fully attended, but I wasn't here. My 3 comments are, maybe 2, 3. One is there is hope for this generation. I was in a really great session yesterday on leadership that started off with, I guess it was Toscanini, ended up with Orpheus. And the person presenting it had 4 really good clips that were just including Leonard Bernstein and everything. So there's hope for this generation. She did a great job. And I really, really enjoyed it. For Peter, for me, an awful lot of Peter was around the piano. I don't know if you all mentioned it while I was away, while I was taken away, shall we say. It was just so much fun at OBTC. Year after year, he was so lively and fun, and then it would lead into interesting conversations afterwards. I guess the third thing is, David, you might know better than I do, but I was doing a chapter for you in a book that you edited. And I think that's when I contacted Peter about the Whitewater book. And he was just enormous. He sent me whatever I needed to give me permission to do whatever I wanted to do. And he was just really, really caring and loving and kind to me. And I appreciate it, and still do appreciate it a lot. For me, it was, Peter was so much more, just fun all the time, fun.
Thanks, Judy. I want to get you in on this because you've been to a lot of our conferences over the years, and I'm sure you were at that piano a few times. What are some of your thoughts of Peter Vaill? You got to unmute. You got to unmute. Yeah. There you go. Oh. No, you turned to there. Unmute. We've been doing these Zoom things now.
All right.
There we go. You got
There
it.
you go.
All right.
I think, and there are quite a number of people here, when I was a young assistant professor and I started our lecture series at George Williams College, and I came to OBTC not knowing anybody. I hadn't even gotten my PhD. I was under Peter Sorensen part-time. And I'd find the people that I thought I wanted to bring on campus. We started the Contemporary Trends in Change Management in 1976 with Blake and Mouton. And many of you on the screen have been there. I identified Peter, and Peter was amazing. He didn't know me from Adam. And I knew him from the piano and from some of his stuff, but I wasn't a graduate student then. And he was so incredibly wonderful. He came to campus. He spent hours with me. He spent hours with our master's students. He spent hours with our PhD students. And one of the things that touched me deeply was how much he cared about listening to the students. Many of them were MBA students and PhD students. They were all practitioners. And he, even though he talked, I think half of the time he listened. So what I get from him was what a wonderful, generous person he was. And afterwards, he wrote me the most beautiful thank you note that said, I can't tell you how honored I was to be a part of your lecture series. And I still have that thank you note, okay, in my stuff. And I haven't been teaching for 15 or more years. And so those are the things. Do I remember the piano? Oh my God. Okay. Do I remember the piano? I do. Actually, one of the things besides Peter, and he used it, many of you may remember Harvey Kolodny from Toronto. He and I did a songbook. Peter and we worked with Peter to do a songbook. I don't know where they are, but we printed them. And so Peter was always part of that, and we were always there with him, Jim Stoner, until Jim's place closed down.
Yeah.
So those are my thoughts, and that was before I was a PhD student.
The hidden life of Peter Vaill, but he I was told, I somewhat remember it, that anyone would name a song,
he knew it.
He knew it, and I don't think he ever read into sheet music. He just was one of those guys. He loved sailing, he loved music, he loved a lot of things, and he loved us. We only have a few more minutes, so if I have any other thoughts that people would volunteer, I would certainly want to capture them.
Just one quick memory, which is kind of happy and poignant for me, was I felt very honored. I forget what year it was now, and I can't remember which conference, but there was a year in which the Society gave the David Bradford Award to me and to Peter. And I felt honored, and I thought, that's great. And the only sad part was Peter wasn't able to get to the I was hoping we could be there together. And I can't remember, some years before that was the last time I saw Peter. So I have not seen Peter since he had that tragic operation and so on that left him in a wheelchair. So I wish I'd had that opportunity.
That's a great thought. I'm going to make a quick round here. Anyone? Last thought, Alan? I have to tell people unmute, so unmute first.
Yeah. What's floating through my head is the two sides of the dance. I think it's important to have thoughtful practitioners and practicing academics. A lot of our conversations about how we get colleagues to understand that that's where the action is in that moment. It's not practice only, because then you'd just be a doing idiot.
Yeah.
And it's certainly not just abstract research and theory, because then you're another kind of thoughtful idiot. It's that's part of what Peter left everybody. As I listened, and I was also, I'll just say, I was reflecting on how Peter helped legitimize what my inclinations were anyway. I mean, I never felt like I would, even when I was a doctoral student, I just had stumbled into it and was getting credit for doing work, and became an academic. And I was well into it before I knew that I really wanted to do it. I was laughing after our conversation the other day, thinking, won't it be great to know what I want to do when I grow up? And here I am retiring, and I still say the same thing. But Peter helped legitimize the territory, and I could feel no ambiguity, no uncertainty, no doubt about the fact that I chose a career in which a lot of what I've written isn't counted by the A Journal academic, and it's okay.
There you go. I guess I can't go all the way around because we are supposed to be done around now, but I would like anyone else to have a moment. If you'd, Kathy, you haven't a chance to say very much. You've been a great listener, and you're also extremely accomplished practitioner in the World Peace Organization.
Well, I'll just throw out that I continued to be inspired by Peter throughout his life, many years after I was lucky enough to study under him. His resilience, his spiritual centeredness with all he had to go through throughout his life was just total inspiration to me.
Yeah, I think that's the right note to end this tribute to Peter Vaill, in that I was able to see him in his last year and a half, almost every week. I saw him deal with pain that was inconceivable because it was phantom pain, but it was real, and it kept him constantly off balance, and he had other things related to being paralyzed in terms of having to be hospitalized. He always came back. He always was ready. And even in the middle of a recorded conversation, if he had a pain spike, he'd say, "Just a minute, Dave." He'd fight down a pain that would stop a rogue elephant. And then he'd say, "Well, where are we?" And he'd continue. So that, you'll hear it when I hope you do come and listen to Peter talk. You're hearing what Kathy just said. And that has to be spiritual. That's got to come from the spirit, because it sure as hell doesn't come from the body or the mind. That was Peter wanting the world to have another moment or two of his thought about the marriage of practice and theory, and how much richer our lives will be and our students' lives will be if they could get that point and appreciate both. So thank you all for being such wonderful friends of Peter Vaill and sharing some great thoughts. And I hope that we don't have to do any more tributes to anyone that we know for a long while.
Immortality, here we come. Thank you, Dave, for putting this together and hosting, and thanks all of you.
Thank you, Dave.
Thanks, Dave.
David, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for doing this, Dave. Bye-bye.
All right. Stay well.
Bye-bye.
And listen to our podcast. Take care.